All right. My name is Alec. I'm a research manager here at Citrus, where I work across a variety of initiatives, including healthcare, the Foundry, at Citrus, the Invention Lab, Social Ops Lab. So I'm here to welcome our speaker today, welcome web viewers from the other campuses. But before we do that, there's just a couple announcements I wanted to sort of get out there. I've been told to give. There is today from 6:30 to 8 p.m. there is an editing blitz for the Big Ideas competition over at the Blum Center. So if you are about to submit something for the Big Ideas, you should go check that out, and they will give you feedback on your proposal. And tomorrow is actually the deadline for pre-proposals for this year's Big Ideas contest. And so, I'd like to introduce our guest today, who's, very generously given his time to come talk to you about, digital healthcare. So Ted Driscoll is a partner in the digital healthcare at Claremont Creek Ventures. He's been with Claremont since the beginning, and he really brings 30 years of experience in health and imaging technology, both as an investor and an entrepreneur. So, Ted is an expert in digital health and diagnostics, and really all the way from big data to health technology to genomics and personalized medicine. Prior to Claremont Creek, Ted has actually founded 5 successful companies in the imaging-related market. And so really, he's bringing quite a wealth of experience. I won't go into each one of those, and I'm sure Ted will probably mention some of those with some probably really great stories. But Ted is also an angel investor, or was an angel investor with Life Science Angels, and founding director of Sandhill Angels and Health Tech Capital. So Ted actually has a PhD from this other school across the bay called Stanford in digital imaging, a master's from Harvard in computer graphics and remote sensing, and a bachelor's from University of Pennsylvania. He holds more than 40 patents in the U.S. and internationally in imaging-related fields. So with that, I will hand this over to Ted.
Thank you very much, Alec. Okay. Sometimes you're in the middle of a revolution and you don't really know it until afterwards. You look back and you say, oh my God, it was a revolution. Think about it. You're all walking around today with cell phones in your pocket. 20 years ago, that would have been considered impossible. Now, everybody's doing it. So there are revolutions that are happening. Sometimes you're in the middle of, you don't even know it until afterwards when you look back at it and realize the revolution. There's a revolution going on in healthcare right now. It's almost hard to explain. I'm going to use an example. When I was a kid and I got the sniffles, my mom took me to my pediatrician, Dr. McFadden. I remember him as a god. And he would stick a stick down my throat and look down my throat. He'd look up my nose. He'd take my temperature. He'd do a couple of other things. And then he'd say, it's probably viral bronchitis or something like that. Drink plenty of fluids and call me in the morning kind of thing. He was making an inference of what I was suffering from based on very, very limited data, observations, effectively. So that's what it was like in those days. It was kind of a renaissance in the sense that he was actually doing things scientifically as opposed to sort of hocus pocus. But what's happened in the last 50 years is the amount of data that a doctor is making a decision from has grown astronomically. Okay? And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today, is the scale of data that we're talking about here. This is my grandson. He is informationally unique in the human species. There have been approximately 100 billion humans who have lived on this planet since the beginning, since Homo sapiens, in effect, separated from Homo erectus, in effect. Approximately 100 billion. And I'm going to show you how he is informationally unique. I'll also tell you that when he was born with a medical record, electronic medical record, that was approximately 1 terabyte in size. It was drawn from a fetal blood sample pulled from his mother's arm when she was 9 weeks pregnant. So before he was born, they already had his genetic profile. And so a doctor knows already what drugs he will respond to, whether he's predisposed to various diseases or not, a lot of things about him. And I'm visualizing how much different Theo's childhood is going to be compared to mine when they stuck a stick down my throat and asked me whether I could say ah or something. So I'm going to tell you why he's different, why he's unique. What makes us different? I mean, basically, I'm 190 pounds of meat and bones. This person in front of me is 190 pounds roughly of meat and bones. And frankly, if you kind of look at us, we look different. But if you start looking at us microscopically, for example, frankly, we don't look very different. It's when you get down into the information content inside our bodies that it makes us different in some way or another. And I'm going to talk about that in particular. My body has about 100 trillion cells in it, okay? There are about 6 billion base pairs. That means that each cell in my body of those 100 trillion cells contains a 6 billion base pair content of information. They're all pretty much the same. When they vary, that's bad. That means maybe there's a mutation or something, and maybe you've got cancer, or it may mean something completely benign. But we start off with a number of 6 billion base pairs that make me different from you. And every person in this room is about 0.1% different in their genomes. Then there's an epigenome that's laying on top of the genome. It's methylation patterns that turn things on or off, turn things up or down in your genome, the expression factors that you make, the proteins that you make. The epigenome is not very well understood yet. Okay? It is an information content that tends to reflect the experiences you've had in life. For example, if you've been in a very stressful situation, certain areas that regulate stress production, cortisol production, are affected by the epigenome. They may be turned up or turned down. PTSD is frankly an epigenomic disease. It is a disease caused by excessive stress that a person has undergone. We don't know really how big the epigenome is, but it lays on top of the genome, so it's roughly the same size, maybe a little bit smaller because some areas tend to be junk, not so important. Then we carry around inside our bodies a microbiome. Each one of our bodies, that 100 trillion cells that we have, roughly 10 times as many microbes are in our body. 10 times. We are outnumbered, in effect, in our body by the microbes that occupy our body. Basically, we're cruise ships, and we got a lot of passengers that we're carrying around. Our genome, our cells, are really just hosts for a microbiome full of bacteria, viromes, all kinds of things. And it turns out they're also very important to our health. Asthma, a number of irritable bowel syndrome. These diseases are areas where the microbiome has gotten distorted in some way or another, and you're not properly handling food, or you're not properly handling the signals you're getting from your body. On the other hand, we need the microbiome. If we were completely pure without a microbiome, we would not be able to digest a lot of foods because bacteria help us digest foods. So we are villages. We are cruise ships, basically with bugs in us. And there are a lot of them, okay? A quadrillion, approximately. We have approximately 1 to 5 billion distinct immune cells in our body. These guys are remembering the diseases or the pathogens or the invaders that we've experienced in our body, and they remember them, so if they see them again, they know they're good or bad. They will attack them and eat them. Everybody's immune system is a little different because I've been exposed to different bugs than you guys have been exposed to. So as a consequence, our immune system is another differentiating factor. And that immune system tends to go awry every once in a while. It can cause autoimmune diseases where, in effect, your immune system attacks your pancreatic cells, the islets of Langerhans, and all of a sudden you become diabetic. There are all kinds of autoimmune diseases as well. So understanding the immune system is also a very, very critical factor in understanding the difference between people. There's a virome. Viruses are just simply hunks of information floating around in the body. Most of the viruses floating around in our body don't affect us. They affect the bacterial microbes that occupy us. Some of the viruses do affect us. Obviously, if I get Ebola, that's not going to be good. Okay, that's a virus. But there are a lot of viruses in our body that are completely benign. completely benign. And in fact, if you've read much about the genomic literature, in some cases their digital code has been incorporated into our genetic code as well. There's signs of the viruses that have affected us many, many generations ago and are in our genome. There's a communicome. These are the chemicals that are used to communicate between the brain and the pancreas, for example, or the stomach and the throat, or the bowel, or something. There are a lot of chemicals that are used in our body to signal from one organ to another, and this communicome can get screwed up sometimes, and you can find all of a sudden that your immune system is interrupting it or whatever. So that's another thing that differentiates us, and there are millions of communicome molecules. And there's a proteome in the end. Genes make proteins, and the proteome itself is quite large, okay? We don't really know the extent of a lot of these things, but every person in this room is different in every one of these categories. So the fact is, that's why my grandson, Theo, is unique informationally, because he's a unique combination of all of these different variables. Now we're going to make it even more complicated. The number of cells in my body changes as I grow up, obviously. My genome is mostly stable. When it gets changed, it's typically a cancer or a mutation of some sort or another, and it means something. But the epigenome changes slowly during my life, but it adapts to the stresses and things that I run into. The microbiome changes daily, depending on whether I went to a Thai restaurant or a Chinese restaurant or an American restaurant or something, or what kinds of foods I eat. My immune system changes daily based on the pathogens that I've encountered, the viruses I found in the BART, or something like that. So my immune system is changing daily. And all these other things are changing daily as well. The point I'm making is, it's not even standing still. All these major information sources that are characterizing me and making me different from someone else are changing on a daily basis. The medical profession, based on its Hippocratic Oath, has to take these things into account in the future as we get more and more reliable ways of dealing with this. So this is what I am investing in as a venture capitalist. I'm investing in the way in which healthcare is revolutionizing as we get to the molecular basis of disease. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to talk to you a little bit about what that medicine field is like, what it's becoming, and about the companies that we've invested in, and show you the places where I think it's going to affect medicine first. The first company that I invested in 7 years ago is a company called Natera. They do non-invasive prenatal testing. When I mentioned that Theo had been tested, he was tested by Natera, okay? They take a small blood draw, 5 milliliters of blood from a mother at 9 weeks of pregnancy, and they had his genetic profile from the fetal DNA that is in the mother's blood. They also do in vitro fertilization screening. They do product of conception, which is a miscarriage analysis to figure out what was wrong, and they do carrier screening. Are you carrying unusual genetic variations that you may not want to have children with, or you want to make sure you don't, that this child isn't also damaged with? So this is a company that's growing very, very fast and is one of our strongest performers. I'm going to talk about it in a minute here, but I want to talk about the next one, AssureX. This is another area where I think genetics is going to have a huge effect. AssureX can tell you whether you will respond or not to over 100 drugs at the present time. They do a cheek swab, grab your genome, and figure out whether A, you have the P450 pathways that metabolize the drug fast or slow, and B, whether you have the receptors, like serotonin receptors, that will cause you to be affected by this drug or not. I'm not sure you know much about this, but in the psychiatry field, they've been doing trial and error for the last 50 years. They try a drug and see if it works, and if in 6 weeks you don't feel better, they try a different one. Well, this is a company that will tell you what drugs are going to work with you and what are not going to work with you. And I confess I was tested by it, and I discovered that they were calling it right. They do antidepressants, anti-anxiety, antipsychotic, ADHD, and analgesia, pain relief. And I know that the ones they called for pain relief were the ones that did work for me. Okay? So this is a very interesting company, also growing very quickly. They right now cover approximately 1/3 of all the prescribed drugs in the United States. And a lot of drugs in the United States are being kind of like randomly given because the doctor has always given a person with these symptoms this drug. This is where we're going with personalized medicine. The drugs that work for you may not be the drugs that work for the person next to you. The next one we've invested in is a company called Prime Genomics. It's actually out of Berkeley. What they're doing is looking at a saliva sample, and they can detect the expression factors of breast cancer prior to it being visible in a mammogram, when it's only 10 cells in size. So the idea is early detection of cancer. Now, it turns out Natera, that I talked about earlier for prenatal diagnostics, is also working now in the cancer space. If you think about what Natera is doing, is they're seeing a very weak fetal signal against a very strong maternal background. Well, it turns out cancer is the same problem, seeing a very weak, malformed signal against a very strong normal background. So these two companies are both working on this. And you can hear on the press, there are a number of companies that are looking now at cancer and what is the difference between this person's cancer and that one's cancer. Actually, stop for just a second. Do you remember? There used to be like 15 kinds of cancer, and they were named by the organs they affected. I can tell you now, there are 19 kinds of breast cancer, and I understand the most recent ACOG analysis is showing that there are actually 130 kinds of breast cancer based on the mutations that are involved that make them different. So cancer is rapidly becoming spread out to being specific to what is the mutation, the pathway that's involved. Then we did an investment in a company called Gigagen. Gigagen looks at your population of T cells in your body and determines when you are about to have a flare, for example, for MS or for any autoimmune disease. They can see the populations of T cells, of one T cell growing relative to another, and they can see, oh, this person's about to have a flare. They can see it before you feel it. So you can then treat it with something to suppress that effect so that you don't have a strong autoimmune reaction to it. And it means that you don't have to use as big a dose of drugs because you catch it much earlier. Then another company we've invested in, NewMed. It's doing something which I think some people will call a non sequitur, digital pharmacology. What that means is they are deciding what drugs will work with what diseases, with what mutations based on big data, on database analysis. They've licensed data from Thomson Reuters and a whole bunch of other large cancer databases and things like that. To give you an example of one of the things they did was they discovered a shelved antidepressant that had been used in the 1960s but was not as effective as other antidepressants, so it was put on the shelf. They discovered that it stops small cell lung cancer in its tracks, dead, kills it immediately. And what was interesting about it was they were able to go back and look at the paper medical records of patients in Britain who had received this drug. Guess what? If you're told you have cancer, you often get depressed. So this antidepressants were prescribed to these people, and they discovered that the ones who got this drug all went into remission for some reason, and no one noticed. So this is what's going to happen, is you're going to start seeing pharmacology is not about throwing chemicals at hundreds of mice and seeing which ones do better or worse. It's going to be computational. It's going to be entirely done using big databases of pathways, big databases of drugs that have been shelved or aren't being used in some way or another, and repurposing these drugs. We're finding, for example, an anti-epileptic drug that treats irritable bowel syndrome. No one would have guessed that epilepsy had anything to do with the irritable bowel syndrome, but in fact, it has a much better effect than all the drugs that are available right now. So this is what this company does, is computational pharma, effectively. Now I'm going to actually talk a little bit, I'm going to extend your minds a little bit more here, okay? Think of the genetic code as just simply being quaternary code, not binary code. It's the same. It's code. It contains information. It happens to be base 4 instead of base 2, okay? Genetics is just quaternary code. A's, C's, T's, and G's. So we made another investment in a company called Geneweave. What Geneweave does is they found a virus, it's actually called a phage, that affects Staphylococcus aureus. It does not affect humans, it only affects Staphylococcus aureus. It can find Staphylococcus aureus in any bowl of snot, it doesn't care. It's spent 30 million years living in our noses and things like that. It knows how to deal. It doesn't require any sample preparation. So you can take basically a nasal swab and stick it in this thing. What they did was they re-engineered the genome of the phage so that the phage glowed. It made luciferase. It made lightning bug protein, in effect. So what they've done is they've actually made a living organism, in effect, a bacteriophage, do our work instead of its work. and detect a Staphylococcus aureus very early. Now, what they do is they throw into the sample various antibiotics. So if the antibiotic killed it, then it's not alive and it won't glow. But if the antibiotic didn't kill it, it will glow. So they can figure out antibiotic resistance. They can find susceptibility to a drug. And basically what it comes down to in the end is, here I'm a computer scientist, we're just using code inside a genome to do computation, to do search effectively. So the genome is actually functioning almost like a computer program. The only great thing about it is these phages, they love snot. They don't have any problem with it. You don't have to do any sample preparation. That's the world they've been living in. So healthcare is going through a huge revolution. And I personally believe that doctors are going to need to take artificial intelligence into the room with them. That the data that's available to a doctor is too big for a doctor's head to understand, too big to hold it all. And so I believe you're going to see computers becoming fundamental to the whole diagnostic process and, frankly, controlling the therapy devices as well. I think you're eventually going to go to Walgreens with a general prescription from your doctor, and the Walgreens is going to look at your genome and make a custom prescription for you that works with your genome. Everybody's drugs will be different and unique to them, unique to what affects them. I'm going to end here with a couple of big thoughts, a couple of interesting ideas, okay, that I sort of picked up over the years of working in this space and talking to a lot of people. The first thought is kind of interesting to me, and I'm going to talk about it for a second here. Cancer, everybody thinks of cancer as a mutation. I believe cancer is actually a reversion to our single-celled past. When cells were single-celled, living in the Precambrian ocean, they survived based on the ability to be efficient in metabolizing things and reproduce fast. And that's exactly what a cancer does. I think that when we went multicellular, it was mostly about breaks. It was about getting everybody coordinated, all the cells together, working together. And what breaks down in cancer is those breaks. All of a sudden, the cells go back to their old form, their old style of reproducing. I don't give a shit about my neighbors. I'm just going to reproduce as fast as I can. So I think cancer is actually a reversion to our single-celled past effect in some ways, okay? We, in effect, the brakes have failed. The things that caused the cells to all kind of work together have failed, and now they're going off on their own, independently. That's one reason why when you look at cancers surgically, there's a lot of dead tissue in there because they can run over each other. They wipe out each other's blood supplies and things. They don't pay attention to their neighbors anymore, whereas the cells in my normal body do. Here's another thought. I think aging is actually programmed in. I think that, well, put it this way. If Darwin says survival of the fittest, what he's really saying is death of the not-so-fit, okay? The fact is, in order to change, in order for us to adapt to a changing climate and a changing situation, you got to basically roll over the population and give the newer people a better advantage, the ones that have a better advantage that survive more and reproduce more. So I think death is actually necessary to evolution. And I think that, in fact, we're going to figure out that aging in the next 50 years or so, and that is going to be one hell of a sociological problem, okay? The fact is, aging, I think, is programmed in. And I think that, frankly, our age, our lifespan, is a function of how fast our environment around us is changing. In areas where the environment is changing very fast, they want to turn generations over fast so they can adapt quickly. On the other hand, when we are in a relatively stable environment, or an ability to adapt to these changing environments, then it isn't quite so fast. Aging lifespan isn't so fast. But remember, until just 100 years ago, we lived 40 years. And I would not be surprised in my lifetime to see people living 120 years. So we're already making major changes on this. And I think this is going to be a very interesting sociological problem later in our life. The last interesting thought is pretty wild, okay? Think about an alien civilization coming to our planet and saying, what is it about life? What is life on this planet? I don't think they're going to think of us as humans. That the humans are the life. They're going to think the DNA is the life. The DNA contains the information. We're all just experiments. We're all just walking around with different variations of that information. The thing that's really unique about life on this planet is the replication, the information content in our bodies, and that's DNA. So when you look at the planet from space, in one of those photographs or something like that, think about the fact that what it really is DNA from the smallest single-celled creatures all the way up to the most complicated creatures. It's sort of the living thing. It's the unique kind of life on the planet. We're just vessels, experimental vessels that are walking around. That's a broad thought, but I kind of like the idea of thinking about us as being just information. That's all I have to talk about today. I'm very happy to answer any questions if anybody has. I hope I didn't blow all your minds.
In thinking about the genome and the other parts of the information spectrum, are the tools necessary for evaluating that kind of big data any different from the kind of tools that are being used to evaluate energy data or other data?
The computational tools aren't. The database tools aren't. Although I will say we are seeing companies that are making specialized databases that are structured to make genomic search easier as opposed to searching checkbook records or something like that. So the structure of the database may be different, but the tools aren't very much different. What is different is the data capture. An Illumina HiSeq is a very different device than a power meter from Johnson Controls or something. So the data capture is much more complex. But I will say the thing that's changing about genetics and making it such an interesting field is that the rate of change of genetic sequencing is happening so fast, it's far faster than Moore's Law, far faster than Moore's Law. So I think that within the decade, the genome is going to be just considered to be part of everybody's EMR, just the natural part. And what I was trying to show with some of those earlier things is, unfortunately, we'll be then figuring out, the epigenome is also important. The microbiome is also important. And they don't stand still. They change all the time. But I think that the tools, the computational tools, are not that different. They're pretty much the same. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think will be one of the biggest resistance or challenge to this revolution? And will there be concerns with privacy and people wanting this type of data being shared?
Yep. Well, the first thing I will tell you is one of the biggest challenges I face as an investor in this space is doctors are resistant to change. They're resistant to change because of the fact that they'll get sued if they don't do something which is in the standard of care for their particular specialty. And quite frankly, only the last 5 or 10 years worth of doctors have ever even had genetics taught to them in school. So all of a sudden, this deluge of information, there's a lot of resistance to accepting that information. I remember actually a couple of weeks ago at a social event, the head of a geriatrics institute at a major hospital who had just retired told me flat out he thought genetics was all hocus pocus. He thought it was all baloney. It had nothing to do with health. It was all about how you lived and how you exercised. And that's because he went to medical school in the 1950s. And I think it was before Watson and Crick had found the double helix. So he doesn't really understand that. So the rate of change of science is probably faster than the rate of change of medicine's ability to absorb it. Okay? Now, as far as the privacy issue is concerned, the fact is every person who walked into this room probably left their DNA on the doorknob. So you're leaving a lot of information behind all the time. Okay? And the GINA Act that was passed about 10 years ago in Congress does not allow, it forbids insurance companies from taking advantage of your genetic information, okay? But frankly, I think it's going to be very hard for that to stand up because one of these days your genome is going to be so transparent, your doctor's going to be able to tell you how long you live. And so this is one of the big challenges we have right now is this huge explosion of information and availability of information. There's both pros and cons. And privacy is going to be a very challenging issue, I agree. Yeah.
Just an extension, basically, to that comment. What are the sort of bottlenecks? I mean, I think there's a crush of data and information out there, but as it gets to a point of care, do you feel like industry is finding value at an appropriate rate, or is it having a difficult time doing that, or is it sort of inertia, either or resistance from regulatory issues or from adoption from the medical professional communities you mentioned?
Yeah.
I sort of wonder if there is sort of a bottleneck in finding value in all of that data.
Well, first of all, I can tell you when I was in the information space, in the medical imaging space, developing the first MRI scanners a long time ago, the FDA was a huge problem, okay? But I can tell you all of the companies that I showed you there are not regulated by the FDA. They're all doing something called a CLIA lab approach. They're using standardized laboratory approaches, and they're providing information to a doctor. The doctor makes the decision. And so as a consequence, they are not subject to regulatory things right now. But to me, it's not that the technology isn't advancing fast enough, because it is. I saw a company a couple of years ago that could tell whether you were going to develop Alzheimer's disease or not. We did not invest in it because there are no drugs. If you are developing Alzheimer's disease, it will stop it at the present time. So the point was, I only invest in things that are actionable. Okay, I don't invest in things that are going to tell me something I just frankly don't want to know. Okay, I think that the science and the technology field is advancing a lot faster than the medical field's ability to absorb it in some cases. And I think that the diagnostic side is advancing faster than the therapeutic side. And that's one of the challenges is always when we look at a company, a startup, is there a therapy that will result from this diagnosis? And will it actually affect a doctor's decision making? As opposed to just tell me how many steps I had last Tuesday or something, which is not information that a doctor can use. So there are a lot of resistances. I do feel like a person who's jumped out of an airplane and cannot fall any faster than a certain amount. There's just like change cannot happen faster than a certain amount simply because people who went to medical school 2 years ago are already becoming obsolete. And it's hard for doctors to keep up. So, yeah.
You have a background in medical imaging too, and imaging is a lot of data. How do you see the big data revolution coming to imaging, and what are the main challenges?
Well, it's already come in some ways, in the sense that when we first developed the first MR scanners, we were producing gigabytes of information where they had been accustomed to slapping film on a film box, you know. And so as a consequence, I can remember the first radiologist actually coming up to a keyboard and like typing, like they didn't quite know what to do with this screen that was in front of them and complaining about the phosphors in the screen and things. But on the other hand, I said, I just gave you 512 slices. You want me to make 512 pieces of paper, a piece of film? That doesn't make sense. So the radiology field was one of the first fields to actually have to deal with the big data aspect. They came up with a DICOM standard that allowed people to move data from one to another. And so they've actually confronted a lot of these sharing issues a lot earlier than everybody else. Right now, an Epic system can't talk to a Cerner system about the EMR, the electronic medical record. They are very balkanized right now. So in some ways, I think the medical imaging field is ahead because they have had to confront this issue 20 years earlier, effectively. Now, that being said, I just saw a startup a couple of weeks ago that was basically putting radiology images on somebody's iPad. So you could be sitting in a restaurant and a doctor could basically send your iPad some images and say, do you think that looks like a tumor or not? You know, and you could be consulted on that. So I do think that mobility and sort of big screens and being able to be in a restaurant looking at an MR scan, that is happening. That revolution is happening in radiology right now. I also have seen a company recently that does automated interpretation of radiology images. They don't actually say, oh, this person does have breast cancer. What they do is they circle the areas that are anomalous. And so when the radiologist goes through them, he can see, oh, that is odd. That he might not have seen it as he was flipping through all the images. So I think we're going to see, again, it's artificial assistance of the medical profession, not doing the job of the doctor, but helping the doctor do his job better. That's where I think it's going to happen. And I think radiology is one of the first fields that it will happen. Yep. Yes?
I got a really loud voice.
Yeah, but
okay, all right.
Modesto can't hear you.
Oh, Modesto, okay.
Yes.
This is for you. Most of the conversation about privacy is usually in the context of the insurance companies. Mm-hmm. In countries that have national health care, which is most of the industrial world except for
the US,
the idiot Americans, does that play out the same way? It seems to me it might not.
We talk about HIPAA regulations all the time in my company, and in the companies that I'm invested in, the HIPAA regulations are a huge issue. And it's a balance that has to be struck, because on the one hand, yeah, the fact that I happen to be carrying a genetic marker that means I'm going to develop a certain disease earlier than other people, and therefore I'm a bad life insurance risk, is important. On the other hand, when the information is anonymized, that vast pool of information has all kinds of valuable content in it. You know, to find out that everybody who drank Coca-Cola on Tuesdays ended up getting cancer on Saturdays or something absurd like that. But the point is there's a lot of information to be mined in that data. So I don't think there's an answer on one side or the other. I think it's a balance point that has to be struck. And I think you're going to see a lot more anonymized data where they don't basically have your name attached to it. They say a man of this age and this size and characteristics has this particular genome and leave it at that. I don't think we're going to see Gattaca. I don't think we're going to be checking into the BART by giving our DNA to the people. I don't think we'll see that. Okay?
One quick follow-up. No, let it go.
Okay.
Last month, there was an article in Wired magazine about AI, and they focused a lot on Watson being repurposed for the medical field.
Yep.
Wonder if you could comment on how what Watson is doing interacts with the companies you're investing in, the information that's coming out of those
I'm quite aware of it. The head of the Watson project is a friend, so I know him, and I've talked to him a lot about that. My companies right now are dumping their data back into the EMR of the doctor, in effect. They're not trying to, with the exception of one, which I think you may be familiar with, there is one company in our portfolio that is a cloud-based company that is just trying to be a cloud reservoir for genetic data. That is one company that is, and they're HIPAA compliant, and they are trying to do it very, very specifically for that. But most of my companies are supplying data to the doctor, and he puts it in the EMR, which he controls, and we're sort of letting the Epics and the Cerners and the guys who make medical record-keeping systems take care of the HIPAA regulations of that right now. It's a real problem. I mean, it is a real problem. As we open the curtains and can learn everything about the molecular pathways inside our body, that information is enormously valuable to sort of find patterns that people didn't think were there. On the other hand, I don't want to be in a situation where suddenly my life insurance bill just went way up because they just checked my genome and found out that I'm more likely to die early or late or something like that.
Why aren't the Watson people chasing those companies, though, for their information?
I think that they are. A lot of them are posting their information. I know that Natera, for example, has been asked to anonymize and post the information. Right now, a lot of the healthcare systems they supply to have vetoed that and said, no, you can't do it. I think that the whole culture is right now trying to get its arms around privacy and what should be private and what shouldn't be. And there's an error toward the side of privacy as opposed to toward the side of openness a little bit. It's frankly one of the problems I think that 23andMe is getting themselves into as well, is they're kind of making a consumer-facing information source, and why the FDA said, we don't like this, we want to stop it. Our culture is changing. It has to change to adapt to these big data sources, and it's not going to be easy. There are going to be pros and cons about practically everything, and you're going to have to sort of make a trade-off. Do I want to know more about my condition, or do I want to know less about my condition because it might cost me?
On the topic of sort of, you mentioned these changes of technology information that these physicians really just can't even keep up with these days. So what are some of the opportunities you see to help with that, and what can be done really to make sure that
it was one of the challenges early on as we were picking out companies, was to figure out what areas in the medical profession did we think would be the first adopters of some of this big data, and try to focus our energies there. We thought prenatal diagnostics was one of them because of the fact that never have I ever seen a case where a patient said, I'll pay for it to know, because they're about to bring a baby into the world and they don't want to have a baby who's crippled for the rest of their lives they have to take care of or something, so it's an important issue. We found that drug selection was another one. We found that cancer was another. But there are a lot of them that I'm not convinced that the medical profession is quite ready for. For example, Alzheimer's diagnostics. I'm not sure the medical profession is ready to tell patients, you will develop Alzheimer's disease in 5 years. And frankly, a large percentage of us will. But I don't think that there are a lot of areas right now, unless there's a treatment, unless there's an intervention, I don't think the medical profession wants to know, because they don't want to tell the patient. The bad news is you're going to get Alzheimer's. The good news is we don't know if we have a drug for it. Anyway, yeah.
I guess I have two questions. One was sort of, maybe you could expand a little bit on what Watson is doing vis-a-vis this whole industry. And then the next question, unrelated, is how are rising medical costs affecting your or influencing your decision-making and affecting the evolution of those companies?
Well, Watson's basically a system for finding patterns in large data sets. And you can ask it questions and it will look for that kind of pattern, for example. And so healthcare is a huge data set. And if they can get it anonymized, get it out, then they can find a lot of information in it. I remember whenever the doctor comes in for my annual physical, he spends a lot of time looking at the computer screen, not looking at me, because he's trying to get sort of refreshed on the fact that, you know, I had a colectomy a couple of years ago or something like that. He has to kind of get familiarized with that. Watson could do all that for him. And our AI system could do all that for him, could basically prepare him for the patient as he came in and notice that, oh, he had a bad reaction to a drug 25 years ago that might be appropriate for the condition he's complaining about now. Okay, so I think Watson is going to be a great addition. Watson or Watson-like things are going to be a great addition to medicine because I honestly believe doctors cannot keep everything in their head at this point. It's just almost impossible. Now, I'm sorry, what's the second question?
Healthcare costs.
Costs, yes. I personally believe that healthcare costs are not going to go down for a while, and that's partly because people are living longer, and the new treatments didn't have to be paid for before now have to be paid for. And so I think the healthcare costs are going to level at first. But I think as we get better and better at early detection of things, it's much cheaper to treat cancer when it's only 10 cells than when it's become invasive and is metastasized and gone all over the body. So I think in the long run, this big data will have a cost-reducing effect, but I wouldn't even be surprised if at first it has a slight cost-increasing effect.
So it's not a selling point right now in the development of any of your companies?
We try to invest in areas where it will specifically have a positive effect. So prenatal diagnostics, for example, is a great example. If a baby is born with a serious genetic abnormality, they're going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in the first year of life. Okay, so if we can catch that very, very early and have the parents, intervene in some way or another, or what I'm hoping to see, Natera is coming out with now, is things where you can tell the mother, have more vitamin D. Or something like that, so they can fix, because there's a weak link between some pathway in there that's affected by vitamin D. So take excessive doses of vitamin D. So you can intervene, something besides abort the child. I think that's going to happen. But we definitely pay attention to costs. And one of the biggest things I do pay attention to is the CPT codes and whether there's a reimbursement code associated with this particular test. Or am I going to spend the next 30 years trying to convince some insurer? Almost every one of my companies right now, I tell them very early on, do a cost-benefit analysis. Show how much the test costs and show how much money you save the insurer if he uses the test. Do that analysis. Okay, and so it is definitely a critical factor. It is a critical factor. I can't say it's my role to lower healthcare costs. It's my role to get paid. Okay, it's my role to create value in my company. So I want to get reimbursed. As much as I would love to lower healthcare costs in the entire United States, that's not my task. My investors tell me to make money and return it to them. So, anything else? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank our speaker.
Yeah.